Hi. Hello there. Welcome to a new video. This will be, as mentioned in the previous video, about self-coaching. This is part one of 2 or 3. I don't know how many. It depends how much I yap. The recording, which I did yesterday, for the entire video, was about an hour and a half of footage. Obviously I've trimmed it down significantly, as you can see by the runtime, but there was a lot, so it may end up being 3 videos. But this is part 1. This video will probably be a little bit boring compared to the others. The next video or 2 will be more about variations and technique and long-term planning and, to some extent, the more interesting things about actual programming and self-coaching. This video, however, is what I feel to be probably the more important, which is diving into the kind of underlying mechanics behind programming, i.e. stimulus, adaptation, specificity. One of the things that held me back for a very long period of time was that I did not understand these concepts very well. I didn't understand stimulus very well. I didn't understand what I should be chasing and feeling. I didn't understand what adaptations I was actually getting from the stimulus. And I didn't understand how to correctly apply specificity to my training. So this video will be explaining these concepts, going into what you should be feeling and chasing and whatnot, what the outcomes probably are from your inputs, and hopefully give meaning to the next video or 2 that will be a little bit juicy, a little bit more interesting. So yeah, hopefully it's not too boring, but there's kind of dense. So, but I tried to make it interesting. I think my editing is getting a little better. We'll see though. But yeah, let's begin. An important concept that we will be discussing a lot throughout all of this is specificity. What is specificity? Well, I imagine it sounds quite self-explanatory, but I will go into it. Specificity is the idea that we should be pursuing sport-specific stimulus and adaptations kind of at all times. Let's think of some examples, because you can also get too specific. Say we are doing squat, and we need a squat pattern type variation or accessory to help the hypertrophy of our squat. Say if you're someone like me that has maybe a little bit more of a hip dominant kind of squat, I like to sit back, doing a hack squat is not specific enough for my technique. It just doesn't really do much because my normal squat pattern does not complement that. However, a belt squat does complement it. I can kind of sit back, I can follow my typical kind of squat pattern, a little bit more specific. And that's what we're talking about in terms of specificity. We want kind of everything to complement the sport-specific stimulus and adaptation that we're chasing. In the same vein though, you can get too specific. There's if I can find it, I'll put an image up here. There was an interview I watched with the Russian IPF head coach. What year was it from? I can't remember what year it was from. And there was a particular section where he was talking about hypertrophy and accessories. And he said that conceptually, he didn't really understand the leg extension because it wasn't specific to the squat. And instead he would always give something like a leg press because it follows a squat pattern. And I thought, that's stupid.
Эффективность увеличивается все-таки. Дело в том, что я не понимаю вот этих упражнений, там, подъемы, там, бицепс, бедра, там, на четырехглавую, там, ну, я считаю, что чем ближе упражнение к соревновательному, тем оно эффективнее, и поэтому лучше сделать 2 приседания, чем различные жимы ногами и так далее. Это если там травма спины.
Получается, подсобку вы не даете практически?
Очень мало. Что-то, может, и делаем, но очень мало.
And then you see how everyone, well, obviously the Russians can't compete on it, but you see how everyone, apart from 1 or 2 people, are really not that great at IPF powerlifting in Russia, and you think, this makes sense now. A leg extension is completely viable, it's completely valid, you should be using them if you need just isolation for the leg. It's not like it's stupid because it doesn't follow a squat pattern. But that if we are going to follow a squat pattern, it should be specific to our technique. Does that make sense? Not that everything needs to be dialed in for the specific goal. We can have a wider foundation. I mean, you should have a bit of a wider foundation of strength and hypertrophy and stuff, but for most things, you should be thinking, how can I cater it to the sport-specific goals we're chasing? That kind of encapsulates what we're going to be talking about with specificity. It's not something that should be followed without question, but that it probably should be followed if we can think of a valid or reasonable reason to do it. Hopefully that makes sense. So, in the next chapter we're going to be talking about adaptations, i.e. what we are getting out of all the stimulus we're doing, but we need to discuss what stimulus we're trying to chase. And to do that we need to explain two concepts. I've not seen these actually discussed or mentioned anywhere else. I kind of came up with these. I imagine they already existed somewhere in writing. However, I'm going to claim that I invented them, and therefore I'm the cleverest person in the world, and no one can disprove me. Ooh. Intra-session work capacity and inter-session work capacity. Intra-session work capacity is how well you can handle workload within a session. Inter-session work capacity is how well you can handle volume stimulus, etc. within a week, session to session type thing. Everyone varies a little on these, and I feel like this has made the difference between me being able to actually understand what stimulus I'm chasing, and therefore how to distribute my volume and intensity, again, throughout a single week, so a microcycle, and then a macrocycle, and a mesocycle. I'll get into those in a little bit, but if you have, for example, pretty good intra-session work capacity, i.e. you can do a lot within a session, but you have pretty poor inter-session work capacity, like me, you may want to structure things in terms of 2 SBD days a week, and that's your only exposure to lower body movements. So I have my squat and deadlift within one session, so an SBD a day, and I then have 5 days worth of recovery within the week, distributed in clusters, if you will, and it enables me to get all of it out within one session, have the recovery time I need, then go on to the next. Other people have pretty poor intra-session work capacity, but great inter-session work capacity. I think to highlight this, whenever I have a new athlete start, I give them what I would consider to be my kind of typical starter block to diagnose kind of what their work capacities are, etc. Some people flourish off of 2 SBD days within a week. It works really well, they have all the time to recover, I think it's a good balance of things, whereas some people immediately think, no, ooh, this is not for me, very bad. Because some people need it distributed, they can't cluster it up. And that then informs what kind of stimulus we can actually achieve. Of course, to some extent, it's just how we're distributing it. It's probably going to be the same volume and intensity throughout a week, but it does inform how much stimulus we're getting within a session, how much we can properly chase it. If you are someone who can distribute it really well, you can have more exposures throughout the week, to higher RPEs in terms of leg accessories, in terms of hypertrophy. You can rethink how you're chasing exposure and being primed and whatnot. For someone like me, for example, I have to really push a secondary day because it needs to be earlier on in the week so I have all the time to recover. Some people who might have it distributed a bit differently might have to have a lighter secondary day and more on the main day and stuff like that. So that kind of informs our decisions a little bit. But either way, these are really important concepts to consider. Good to think about it with your own training or with other people just when you're discussing with them, because I feel like a lot of people miss this out, and this kind of explains a lot of issues I see with certain people's programming. I also really want to emphasize the point that I think a lot of people who do self-coaching miss, and I think people miss it because when you're self-coached, obviously a very common thing with all powerlifters is that we enjoy training. It's a sport that is predominantly training, unlike some other sports where you get a lot of time competing, a lot of time on the field or the pitch or whatever it is. In powerlifting, you probably really enjoy the process, you enjoy the training, and especially if you're self-coaching, you probably really enjoy thinking about the training and the process. And it's really easy, therefore, to fall into the trap of doing too much. I think it's really easy to do too much. And I think that's why thinking about the balance of all these things is important. I have in the past fallen into the habit of doing, as you probably guess, too much. Whether it be too much weight, too much volume, definitely too much volume at times. And I think especially during periods of, oh, I'm not prepping, I'm not in the peak, so I'll do a lot of reps, I'll do loads of sets of 8 on deadlift or whatever. And bringing it back to a sport-specific idea, that doesn't do anything. That's pointless stimulus. It's too much, it adds too much fatigue. It's not specific enough. We want to dial into some degree of specificity. And so that kind of stimulus is pointless. And I'll talk about it in terms of the adaptations very soon, because I think it all makes sense why. But we always want the stimulus to be somewhat sport specific. We don't want to be taking it really far out from what we're going to be doing. We compete with top singles, doing loads and loads of sets of 8 on stuff, especially on deadlift and possibly squat, depending on how well you're leveraged. Doesn't really do much. It is kind of developing the wrong adaptations. So, we're going to talk about Russian powerlifting. Now, I talk about this specifically because there are two very distinct eras of Russian powerlifting. Era 1 was the Shaiko era, as we'll call it. This was maybe the late 90s, definitely the 2000s, when Shaiko was the head coach, when they were dominating everything. They would always win the Europeans and the worlds, when powerlifting within the IPF was only equipped. And this era is very distinct. For very high volume training, they would do probably upwards of maybe even 20 sets of bench press within a session. And ridiculous. I'll put some pictures up here because you can find the training programs online and they're worth looking through. I'll put some examples up here of what they were doing. Ludicrous stuff. And they were all on a lot of gear. Which is why they were able to recover from all this work. And when you can recover from all this, you can achieve all the necessary stimulus and adaptations, as we'll talk about later, through this sort of training. You can get all the proper muscular stimulus, all the strength and force output stimulus from just very sport-specific work and doing fairly minimal accessories. Second era of Russian powerlifting is what we'll say now, within the IPF, because there's a whole branch of untested powerlifting, obviously. But current IPF kind of drug-tested powerlifting in Russia, apart from 1 or 2 lifters, just doesn't really exist. Not that there aren't lifters, but that they're not great. They're kind of at the same level as they were a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And they're still at this point because they are trying to train like people did in the Shaiko era. Again, I think I mentioned earlier about the video with the Russian head coach, who was saying that he doesn't understand the leg extension because it's not sport specific, not following a squat pattern, so why would you do it to help your squat? And I think that is a huge issue. I remember watching this interview at the time, and I just all of a sudden thought, damn, that makes so much sense. It makes so much sense about why some people don't improve. It makes sense why I was thinking at the time, the Russians knew so much about Olympic lifting. Why aren't they good at powerlifting? But it also makes a lot of sense in terms of what makes America really good at powerlifting. America has a very good bodybuilding background. There's a lot of general kind of foundational stimulus to be found in a lot of hypertrophy work and a lot of bodybuilding work. And it helps us so much in powerlifting because the thing is, you cannot get enough stimulus from just sport-specific work. If you could recover, sure. And this doesn't just count for powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting as well. Bulgarians, Kazakhs, they won so much gear and they did so much volume with the main lifts that they got all of their necessary stimulus just from singles, doubles, triples with the competition lifts. And if you can do that much, great, but we can't. And this is what I mean when I said earlier that we need a balance. Because we do need a balance. We need a balance of our volume and our intensity on the main lifts. And we also need to match that balance with a lot of hypertrophy work because there is so much muscular stimulus that we need for powerlifting. We really do. I cannot underestimate how much, but for me and for everyone that I've ever trained around, how much muscular stimulus has done for the bench press, for example. If you have triceps the size of a horse, they are not big enough. They need to be bigger than a horse. The more muscle you have, the better. You should always be pursuing lots of muscular stimulus. And you don't get enough from the specific work. Of course, you can get bigger just from doing bench press, but there comes a point where you will adapt for your work capacity and you'll need to do more work. And you need, therefore, to do a lot of hypertrophy and bodybuilding work. So the main takeaway from this particular case study, and I'll probably link a lot of the stuff I talk about in the description. You can have a look through. But when we're deciding our stimulus, when we're deciding how much stimulus we're going to have within a week, of course we want sport-specific things. We want to have all the different kind of variations that we need to improve our technique and our strength on bench press and squat and deadlift. But you will not be able to have all the stimulus necessary from those. Remember, the more muscle we have, the more possible output of force, the more potential we have for strength. So if this is the one takeaway that you, as a self-coached athlete, take away from this video, don't just chase stimulus on the main lifts. Don't just chase, today felt pretty good just from squatting and bench pressing. Walk out thinking, I feel pretty good, I feel like my muscles really worked after squat bench press, and holy shit, I am sore from accessories. That's kind of the mindset you really want. You need not too much stimulus, you can overdo it, but you want a very good, healthy balance of stimulus week to week. You always want at least once every 1 or 2 weeks to come out of the session thinking, fuck, I'm really sore. Kind of everywhere in your body at least once. I always walk out once every few weeks thinking, fuck, my adductors, my glutes, my hamstrings, my quads are sore, my chest, my triceps, etc. You want to be chasing that. And if you never feel muscularly sore, and I know this from experience because for a very long time I didn't do this, I wasn't chasing it properly. I thought, it's been about a year since my chest has been really sore. And then I came to realize, well, yeah, my bench hasn't gone up in about a year as well. That's probably why. You do regularly want to be sore. Because if you're not sore, probably an indication you're not chasing enough stimulus properly. And it means you're not doing enough, and you will not get stronger. So, adaptation. Again, this might be a little bit self-explanatory, but we'll go into what I mean by this, and then we'll go into why it's really important to think of the outcomes of our stimulus. So adaptation is simply how our body adapts to the stimulus and the work it's done. If you do loads of bicep curls, the adaptation is your biceps are going to get bigger. If we do a lot of work on squat, the adaptation is our squat's going to get bigger, both in terms of our musculature and our strength. So, pretty simple. Bringing it back to specificity though, and this is where I think a lot of people who self-coach probably aren't dialing it in properly, we want the adaptation to be specific to what we're actually trying to do within our sport. The adaptations should be furthering the goal of a heavier 1 rep max squat, bench press, deadlift. And I think people think that their stimulus is, but it's not. Also, the sun, I hope it hasn't been flickering a lot, but the sun right now is there. And there is some washing on the clothes, and there we go, I'm being hit by the sun. Hopefully it doesn't look too glaring on camera. So, how can the stimulus be wrong? I'm going to give an example. So, whereabouts was this? I think it was in the lead up to my last comp, which was British Juniors. I think it was about 3 months beforehand I was doing this up until. I had some deficit tempo RDLs. I think there may even been a slight snatch grip in there as well. So one of the slightly complicated variations where there's a lot going on. And I was doing probably with around 140-ish is about how heavy I could go to, because there were sets of 8 to 10. Okay. It provided a decent amount of stimulus. I was tired at the end of those. But the stimulus was wrong. I didn't realise that at the time. So, what did I think it was doing? I thought it was doing a significant amount of hamstring, glute, etc. hypertrophy. And I thought the time and attention for my erectors and my lower back was good. I thought they were going to be good for me. Okay, not entirely wrong, not too bad. However, what was it actually doing for me? It did a moderate amount of hamstring stimulus and fatigue, and I think my hamstrings did get stronger, but there wasn't really any glute. And though for the first few weeks my erectors did get very pumped from doing them because of the time and attention, after a while they just didn't, because I adapted. And what they in fact did a lot of, and they were really good at it, was just making me tired. It was so much time with loading my hands. There was a decent amount of CNS fatigue and just general systemic fatigue developed as a result of these. And it did nothing for me. It did nothing for me. There was so much stimulus, like I was so tired, and it did nothing for me. It didn't further the goal of increasing my deadlift. Now, why is that? So, again, it did a decent amount for my hamstrings. I'll give it that. However, deficit, tempo, snatch grip, sets of 8 to 10. All of these factors decrease the weight every time. I can do RDLs, even with a bit of a snatch grip, with about 200, maybe 210 kilos for sets of 6 to 8 decently. However, I had done all of these things to drive the weight down to 130 to 140. That weight is not heavy enough to make the needle tick in terms of increasing my 1 rep max. It just doesn't. And it took me a very long time to realise that. You need, so of course with injuries and whatnot, that entirely explains it, but to a degree, you do need to be lifting a certain amount of weight to actually drive hypertrophy, stimulus, adaptation, whatever. Of course with hypertrophy, a little bit different. I did develop some hamstring from it, but not nearly enough to actually improve my deadlift. It was so far away from what I'm actually trying to achieve, because what I'm trying to achieve is a heavier deadlift, heavier 1 rep max deadlift. Doing this did nothing. It really just increased my ability to do more work on a deadlift type pattern, and it did not positively impact my normal deadlift. The sun is fucking attacking me. What? Go away. Evil. It did not do that. It just made me needlessly tired, caused an excess amount of systemic fatigue, made me hate my Tuesdays, and drove no positive adaptation. What did drive positive adaptation is when I started doing just normal RDLs, normal stiff legs, movements where I can use an actual substantial amount of weight. There's no set percentage in terms of your 1 rep max that you should be doing movements at, and of course some things are perfectly fine to do with lighter weight, but we do want to think about, is it actually driving some form of positive stimulus? Are our muscles sore? Are we actually producing a lot of force through this movement, or are we just getting tired? Because all that did was make me tired. It did not make me positively adapt in any way. So, with that being said, can we do this to current things in our program? Do we have movements or sets or whatever you want to call it, where we're doing something that is not in a comp specific rep range, that is not within a comp specific variation set, not within a comp specific real load to drive any sort of stimulus, and is making us needlessly tired, needlessly fatigued, and instead that weekly slot, I suppose, in terms of our total recovery capacity, could instead be used for other things that would have a more direct positive impact on our overall stimulus. If you can look at your program and say, you know what, yeah, that's unnecessary, then good. There's more gains to be made. I'm happy for you. If not, good. You're on the right track anyway. I'm proud of you. Basically, it's a win-win. But this idea took me a long time to realise, and I think thinking about things like this has now really helped me, both in terms of my own programming and for some of my athletes. It's really easy to do too much. And so what adaptations we're actually getting from the stimulus is really important to consider. Let's say, as an example, let's take people who do Smolov. Smolov's, I imagine most people know it, a very common kind of myth because it's an obscenely difficult squat program. People who do Smolov do well short term because there's a lot of stimulus. But the thing is, what they also adapt to is the work capacity. The work capacity goes through the roof, which I suppose to some extent great. The more work we can do, the more gains we can make. But work capacity becomes the main adaptation. Programs like that are very high volume were only meant to be done short term for athletes during the off season to boost their strength. And so when you do something like this over an extended period of time, you all of a sudden become dependent on that. And if you start doing that much work constantly, you become permanently dependent on that much work, meaning you will always need that. That's not to say that you don't want to do any work. You do want to increase your work capacity to a reasonable extent, but again, with what I can currently do, and I'm fairly low to moderate in terms of my work capacity, both within a session, within a week, I can improve my 1 rep max squat bench deadlift really well. I can get in all the necessary stimulus. So doing that much volume is not going to make you adapt in the way you want. It will adapt your work capacity, your endurance, etc., etc. We want to be focusing on, again, sport-specific adaptations. We want to get more muscular, and that is a very big sport-specific adaptation. The more muscle we can have in our frame, the better. But we want to improve force production strength, the ability to maintain our positions, etc., etc., for the sport-specific goal. We don't want to be doing all of these very different variations and very different rep ranges that don't make us adapt. So, I was looking at the rough script we have, and I thought, because next video we'll be talking about technique and variations and long-term planning and some other conclusions. And before I got to the conclusion of this video, where I just talk about general training philosophy, I thought it'd be good to very briefly mention accessory work. Accessory work has been something that I've struggled with. I hate bodybuilding. I don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy doing it. I don't enjoy having to think about it. And it's not good that I don't enjoy it, because it's something that I knew that I should enjoy. And this past year I've actually come, luckily, to properly enjoy it. And what's made me enjoy it is having a little bit of variance within my program of it. What I mean by that is, week to week it's never quite the same. I always allow myself and the people I train with slightly change it up so that we can really enjoy it. So some weeks we might have what is exactly on the plan. We might have typical kind of normally 2 to 3 sets of 8 to 10 is the rep range that we normally work with. Always about RPE 9, maybe 10. And some weeks we might think, you know what, instead of this, we're just going to work up to a top set of 4 or 5, and we're just going to go absolute RPE 10 and 11 on it, and then we'll leave it there. Sometimes you think, you know what, fuck it, we're going to do like 4 or 5 sets of triceps. And that variance really allows me to enjoy it. It's a little bit different every time. The stimulus is still the same. I'm still getting a lot of growth and a lot of force production out of all these things, which is great. It's what I want. But keeping it to the same 3x12 at RP7, that's just doing nothing. That's not enough stimulus to grow, and it's frankly quite boring. Now, in terms of what I like to do for accessories, again, based on what I mentioned with sport specificity, we do not need everything to be completely aligned with whatever our technique and movement pattern is for competition lift. I have to flare a moderate amount when I bench press in order to hit bench depth. I do not do all my compound pressing movements flared. I do some flared, some I allow my elbows to tuck a little bit. It kind of depends. It doesn't need to be specific. I feel like I'm getting adaptations from both. I feel like I can get more force production when I tuck, and I feel like I can hit the muscles in different kind of ratios, I suppose, and get some more tricep work in, more shoulder work. Whereas when I flare, I think, yeah, you know what, I'm really getting my chest and kind of some of the other shoulder muscles in there. So both are valid, but either way, I am really pushing, and I'm really getting a lot of stimulus. That's kind of what I want to get at. We do want it to be specific. We want, as I mentioned as well, I want my squat patterns to complement how I squat. I want my hinge pattern to complement how I hinge. I want my pressing pattern to complement how I press. It's very important that we kind of do think about that a decent amount, but it doesn't need to be super, super strict. We can have variation, of course. So, hopefully that wasn't too bad. I think it wasn't too bad. I think it turned out quite well. Next videos again will be a little bit more interesting. I want to talk a little bit more about technique, both kind of how you should approach learning technique initially, but then how you should go about adapting and changing techniques, what kind of variations you probably should be using, because I feel like that again confused me for a lot of years, and the long-term planning aspects, because that's really what I think makes or breaks a really good lifter. If you're not thinking long-term well, then nothing's going to go well. I did also mention, I think at some point during this video, that I would touch on training philosophy, but I'll leave that to next video, because I think talking about training philosophy and the kind of mindset you should have about your training only makes sense when we've talked about the technique and the long-term planning and whatnot, so I'll leave that till next time. I am also, after these videos, I'm going to, well, assuming my competition goes correctly, I'll hopefully be doing a bit of a training cycle recap, where I talk about specifically what I was doing and what I will be doing going forward. And I also want to touch on bench press, because that has been something this year in particular that, on average, all my team has done really, really well in, and I think I've kind of really cracked it in terms of that. So I want to touch on that a little bit. But if anyone is interested in anything else, or expanding on any of the things I've already mentioned, then I will happily will, because honestly, the purpose of this channel is more just that I like yapping about things, and if you want to hear me yap, then I will yap. But on that note though, have a very lovely time everyone. Thank you for watching. Take care, bye bye.